They're over 500, and they're projected to continue to grow until 2029 underneath the current statistics. Now, this is stuff that's open source that you can get, and I can actually read it to you. The gross domestic product for GDP is currently priced in Iran was forecasted to continue to increase between 24 and 29, which has already had 4 consecutive years of increase, over $101 billion US dollars at a 24.15% increase over the next 4 years. Since 2025 to 2022, their gross domestic output is 576.24 billion. So has the sanctions that were lifted been a good thing or a bad thing for Iran and the war on terror?
So I will get you the figures that we have on this issue and see if that helps.
Well, I mean, these figures are government figures. I literally pulled them up since we were sitting here, since you said that. And so I think, I mean, you're the director of intelligence. These are something that you really should know, because the more money they have is not good for the U.S. Would you agree with that?
I certainly think that the more money that they spend on destabilizing activities, on funding various groups, in the
is there any
all of those things are not.
Is there really any debate that Iran is the #1 sponsor of war on terror at this point?
They are absolutely a sponsor.
Okay, so we can both agree that the more money they have is bad.
For that, absolutely.
Okay.
But what I would say is
So
that, for example, if you look
so
at
is this
their
a good thing? Well, ma'am, what I'm trying to get to is we saw a decrease in their GDP when Trump put in strong sanctions and worked with Congress. Those were lifted underneath the Biden administration. Do you agree with those actions?
I don't take policy positions from the intelligence
Well,
community
the intelligence is following the money.
I understand.
So is it from the intelligence perspective, not a policy then, from an intelligence perspective, Director Haynes, was that a good thing?
It's neither a good thing or a bad thing. If you want an assessment on whether or not,
how can you say it's neither a good thing or a bad thing, ma'am, when you just said that they're the #1 sponsor of war on terror? That's not debatable. We know that. And a while ago you said that their economy was faltering, but yet we've seen that it's actually doubled underneath the Biden administration since they lifted the sanctions that Congress and the Trump administration put in place. That means they have more money to spend on this. And you can't say that's not really a policy question. That's from an intelligence perspective. That's got to cause problems.
Senator, so on the economy, why don't we get you our assessment of how they're doing? Even if I'm right that they're having challenges economically, I don't think that necessarily is a line that you can draw directly between sanctions and how their economy is doing. There are a number of factors that obviously you have to look at in order to determine that. And I'm more than happy to do an assessment for you that helps to identify what the impact of either of different sanctions, less sanctions, more sanctions, all of those things on the economy, and then how that relates to spending, for example, on national security issues that are of importance to us, which we do produce an annual report for you on.
Well, I would appreciate that. And I don't think that, we'd say their economy's in great shape. I mean, but we can say that throughout all the, I've say all the Middle East, the middle of the Middle East. We could say that there's a problem there with their economy. But what I'm getting to is that the current position that this current administration has taken underneath Biden has not been helpful for our security posture. We have seen that their economy has greatly increased and is going to continue to increase if we stay underneath the continued projection of the way we're treating Iran currently. I think that our posture should, and you can agree, disagree, or not. In fact, you don't even have to answer it because I'm not going to put you in that position again. We have to relook at our posture we have with them, because their GDP has increased, and that means their spending on the war on terror against us and against our allies has also increased. With that, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Senator Mullen. Senator Warren, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Director Haynes, when you testified before the committee last year, we talked about how crypto is being used to help finance major threats against national security. like North Korea's nuclear weapons program, Iran's ability to evade sanctions, and ransomware attacks on American hospitals. It seems the problem is getting worse. According to the Wall Street Journal last month, crypto has become, quote, indispensable to Vladimir Putin's war machine, allowing Russia to get around sanctions and to throw billions of dollars into its war against Ukraine. According to the Treasury Department, Hamas's terrorist attacks against Israel in October were financed in part with crypto, and their current financing depends on crypto. According to the blockchain analytics firm Elliptic, Iran is deep into crypto. And so let's focus for just a minute on how Iran is using crypto. Director Haynes, reports from our intelligence national security agencies say that Iran uses crypto to evade US sanctions. For example, in 4 years, Binance, just one of many crypto exchanges, processed $8 billion in transactions for Iran. Can you explain what threat that poses for our national security?
Yeah, I think there's no question that cryptocurrency is a significant issue for our national security. And as you say, we talked about DPRK last time, and today we continue to produce statistics that indicate that I think it's now over 50% of their foreign currency revenues are coming through crypto, that there is really just significant exploitation of this as a way to get around sanctions, to ultimately engage in illegal transactions, to support a system, and certainly the ransomware attacks and other things like that demonstrated. And with respect to Iran, we see this. So there's no question that Iran permits the use of cryptocurrencies, right, and smart contracts to pay for imported goods because it lacks access to the US dollar, and that's a consequence of the sanctions regimes that are in place. What is also true, though, and I think is just to frame it, doesn't mean that this isn't a problem, but its use is relatively limited as compared to other transaction pieces. So it's not been as much of a major factor in our judgment as it might otherwise seem. So in other words, we've got in early August 2022, the country made its first official cryptocurrency payment for imports, which were worth 10 million out of a total of 102 billion for imports. So it's sort of a similar challenge in the context of Russia as well, where we see them using cryptocurrency, and I think it is almost certainly going to expand in different ways. But there are some kind of structural limitations on their capacity.
So let's look into that. Let's look at the structural limitations here, because I think what you're telling me is Iran is definitely using crypto to move money around.
Yes.
And to do that to evade sanctions and to fund Hamas. And your assessment is consistent with the assessment of the Treasury Department on this. But that's not all that Iran is doing with crypto. Iran is also making money by processing crypto transactions for other people. So as you know, crypto relies on middlemen. In the crypto world, they're called miners or validators, and they process or verify transactions. The Iranian government officially entered the crypto industry in 2019 because it could make money doing it. So if I sent $1,000 in Bitcoin over to you, Lieutenant General Cruz, and you and I might be sitting here in Washington when we engage in this transaction, but Iran may be the one that is processing the transaction for us and pocketing the transaction fee that I pay. And neither one of us would ever even know that we were enriching Iran through this transaction. According to one estimate in 2021, Iran processed as much as 7% of the world's Bitcoin transactions, enough to earn them about $1 billion. So, Lieutenant General Cruz, the bigger the crypto market gets, the more opportunities Iran has to profit by processing other people's crypto transactions. Let me ask you, how important is it that we cut off this revenue source for Iran?
Well, if I could, what I would say is this is not dissimilar to the previous conversation about the source of revenue, whatever Iran's source of revenue, crypto or other transactions, oil sales, and then how Iran uses it. So it does come the more finances they have available to them, this or other sources, certainly allows Iran to make decisions on how it's going to spend.
All right. So look, we have the tools to cut off countries like Iran from the banking transactions, but those tools weren't designed for cryptocurrencies. So crypto money keeps flowing here. And that's why I'm concerned about any effort to regularize stable coins without giving regulators the full set of tools they need to crack down on terrorist financing. Anything Congress does to legitimize and grow the crypto market must have strong protections so we don't increase money-making opportunities for Iran and other adversaries. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Warren. Senator Rosen, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to thank Director Haynes and General Cruz for testifying today and for your service. And so I guess the theme this morning is Iran, and of course I'm going to expand on a little bit, but Iran and the Russia defense cooperation, because Iran has used the war in Ukraine to bolster its own military partnership with Russia by providing Putin's regime hundreds of drones that have killed Ukrainian civilians. In return, Russia's providing Iran with missiles, cyber tools, air defense systems, and Iran's also seeking to acquire modern Russian fighter jets, helicopters, and radars. So, General Cruz, how does Iran's capacity to produce and export long-range attack drones, evident in both the Middle East and against Ukraine, potentially accelerate the spread of such capabilities globally, particularly with Iran supplying these systems to Russia for its use in war? And I'll just add, if you want to talk about both of these, how does this acquisition also enable Iran to take an even more aggressive posture right now in the Middle East?
I think Iran has spent considerable time and effort to be able to produce the kinds of UAVs and other equipment that others would find value. And they continue to improve the capabilities of what they've been selling over time. You mentioned several hundred. I would say it's probably even 1,000 or more of UAVs that Iran has provided directly to the Russians that they are using on the battle space. And also providing designs so Russian can do their own manufacturing of that. So this has been a somewhat new business line. It's just a continuation of Iran's previous business line, but it does provide two things. One is a revenue source to Iran. It provides also some capabilities to the proxy organizations and other adversaries, and increases their capability and their capacities over time.
Thank you. I'm going to move on a little bit into what powers a lot of these systems, particularly as we think about Bitcoin, cyber, all these threats, artificial intelligence. And so we have a little bit to worry about in artificial intelligence competition. So Director Haynes, as we continue to explore really the potential of artificial intelligence, and we have to really discuss these ethical boundaries, right? Because there's growing concern that our strategic competitors like China, Russia, and others may not adhere to the same ethical standards, especially regarding the weaponization of technology, potentially leading to abuse, which can threaten our global security, our national security. So could you discuss the implications of this difference in ethical standards for AI development and deployment, particularly in terms of threats to our security? And how do we work with our allies to put in these ethical standards? Because we know artificial intelligence, it's garbage in, garbage out. Whatever you put in is what comes out. And that's why this is particularly important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I agree with how you characterize the challenge, and I think it is one of the there's sort of the first order issue, which is an ethical issue, but maybe even a step beyond what you're describing, which is to say that
an educational issue, because computers learn.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. And it's also, I mean, so one is clearly in many respects, generative AI in particular, but AI generally can exacerbate existing threat streams as we've seen them and make our adversaries far more effective and also sort of lower the cost of entry into these kinds of threat streams. So in other words, for information operations, for cybersecurity, for biosecurity, other issues like that, obviously these are technologies that allow you to be more effective and to do so more cheaply in many respects in a number of scenarios. So there's that piece of it. A second piece of it, I would say, is that there are, as you say, different standards that we apply. So for example, our commercial companies will only train their models on what is appropriate from an intellectual property perspective, whereas you may see other countries not paying attention to those kinds of standards and getting into other material, and that can create a different series of challenges in these spaces. And how you sort of develop against that, you obviously need to ensure that you're paying attention to that through regulatory, through standards, through other things that can be useful to try to achieve that. In addition, to your point, we obviously care very much about the governance of AI, how we're applying sort of privacy and civil liberty issues to the work that we're doing. And, I think on the one hand, that may mean that we move sometimes a slightly more slowly, or we're thinking through how it is that we're ensuring what we're producing is consistent with our values and our ethics in these spaces. But at the same time, I actually think that can increase the efficacy in many respects of the work that we're doing, because ultimately what you really want to do is train AI on the best possible data, quality data, things that do not have inherent biases in them, things along those lines that will actually get you to answers that are more effective in answering the questions that you're ultimately trying to do. So we are spending quite a bit of time both on thinking about how we use it in a positive way and for our own mission, but also how to counter what it is that we're seeing, obviously, from allies in these spaces. Maybe I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. I have some questions on anti-Semitism. I'll submit them for the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Rosen. Senator Schmidt, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Haynes, I have a couple questions. So recently you stood up the Foreign Malign Influence Center. And you were quoted as stating that it would allow the FMIC to track disinformation campaigns from a foreign country, but also, quote, the public opinion within the United States. What does that mean?
I don't know. That
Well,
last
actually,
piece
okay.
is,
Well,
sorry.
what are you tracking the public opinion of the United States?
No.
Okay. How is FMIC different than CISA? I thought CISA was created to do this.
Okay. So FMIC is actually, we established it pursuant to a statute
Right.
that asked us to establish it. What we do within the Foreign Malign Influence Center, which encompasses our election threat work effectively across the community, is allocate resources in relation to collection. We work through analytic work that is supportive of what CISA does, for example, but also in coordination with our cybersecurity intelligence threat integration center. And we ultimately coordinate the work that the community is doing in order to counter foreign malign influence. That is not something that CISA does. In other words, CISA is taking our products and the intelligence that we produce and is ultimately deciding what it is that needs to be, for example, shared with local and state partners, with industry, depending on the cybersecurity threat or other things like that, in order to protect our critical infrastructure. Okay. So in a sense, we do the normal intelligence community work that we do, and they basically take that information. Hopefully we are supporting them in their mission to actually take action in response.
Okay. In your 2024 unclassified annual threat assessment, makes several mentions of the threats of misinformation and disinformation. Specifically, the report mentions adversarial state actors leveraging disinformation to attempt to propagate divisive societal issues to weaken America and our democracy. It also references medical disinformation as a threat to global health security. Does how do you? What steps are you doing here? I'm because, as you know, a court has found that there's been great coordination between the intelligence community and government agencies to censor speech in the Missouri versus Biden, the Fifth Circuit, to censor speech. And so the determination was made that efficacy of masks or transmissibility of COVID after the vaccine was taken down at the behest of government actors. So my big concern is, are you using this to quell dissenting points of view? Because I don't know what medical disinformation means, and why, if you're involved with censoring or limiting speech of Americans who may have different points of view, let's say if masks work or not. So is that what you're talking about with medical misinformation?
So just a few things. I think obviously don't play a lawyer in this position, but I would not accept your characterization of what the court has found. And
Well, I would actually was the
certainly-
lawyer that I was the attorney general that filed the lawsuit. So I'm pretty familiar with
Understood.
that case.
Okay, understood. I am just saying that from my perspective, the intelligence community does not and has not engaged in any sort of censorship of.
Well, okay. Well, okay.
the
I
site.
have limited time. So let me just,
Focus in
okay,
on the
sure.
question you're asking, which is just basically in the context of medical disinformation. So, for example, we saw Chinese efforts to ultimately engage in disinformation campaigns about the U.S. vaccine, for example, the quality of those types of vaccines, whether that ultimately, if you take a different vaccine, you might be better. The Russian efforts to do that as well. So that's the kind of
Is
thing.
medical misinformation, if I were to go online right now and say that masks are ineffective and they might actually hurt kids, is that medical misinformation?
Well, you're not a foreign actor, so that wouldn't be foreign malign influence. What we would be looking for is a campaign from another country, such as Russia and China, engaging in disinformation about, for example, what I just described in the context.
So
of
I just,
COVID.
one last question then. So obviously you work with the FBI, right?
Absolutely. The FBI is actually part of the intelligence.
Correct. Have there been any consequences to the FBI's pre-bunking of the Hunter Biden laptop story? Because we know that Elvis Chan was claiming that the Hunter Biden laptop, even though it was in the FBI's possession, was a quote unquote Russian hack and leak operation. And it wasn't, right? We know that it wasn't, but yet there's sworn affidavits now from senior executives of social media companies that said that it's exactly what they were told. Have there been any repercussions? Has anybody been fired for, claiming this was a Russian hack and leak operation when in fact it was Hunter Biden's laptop? And by this way, the story got censored. Has there been any repercussions? Have you done anything about that?
I suspect that we're not going to have the same characterization of the scenario either, but happy to take this offline and see if there is anything that we need.
Genuine concerns about the credibility of the intelligence community after what's come to light in that litigation. And I don't think that's, anyway, I'm happy to talk to you about it more. I'm out of time. Thanks.
Thank you, Senator Smith. Senator Blumenthal, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for being here, and thank you for your service to our nation. There have been reports as recently as this morning about a potential progress in discussions with Saudi Arabia about a pact that, in effect, could lead to normalizing relations with Israel. Those discussions, I'm aware, were underway before the October 7th attack with great promise. Could you update us as to what you know about those discussions and whether an agreement with Saudi Arabia directly without involving Israel in the first stage is possible at this point?
Thank you, Senator. I couldn't, the intelligence community is not involved in those discussions, and but I'm happy to defer that, obviously, and we can get you an answer from the policy community.
Thank you. On Iran, I am somewhat perplexed about what you say in your report. Iran is currently not undertaking the key nuclear weapons development activities necessary to produce a testable nuclear device. But then you say Iran continues to increase the size and enrichment level of its uranium stockpile and so forth. Isn't Iran continuing to take steps that would put it in a position to have nuclear arms?
Yeah, I think we can probably talk about this more in closed session, but I think the distinction that's being made in the report in that particular scenario is basically to say that what they're doing is shortening the time period that it would take for them to actually, for example, enrich a sufficient amount of material for a nuclear weapon if they make a decision to move forward on it, as opposed to actually having made a decision to move forward on it. Does that make sense?
It
Yeah.
does. And I guess that leads to the next question, which is what is the time period now that they have shortened to?
Yeah, I think we can discuss this in closed session and for,
Okay. Could you talk a little bit about efforts to free Evan uh, Goskovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter currently imprisoned in Russia? Are we making any progress there?
Sir, we are working on that. I think we can discuss that in closed session and yeah.
Which leads to my next question. There's a lot of public interest in it. And I've long felt that there's overclassification of information. As you know, the present system dates from, I think it's Harry Truman, executive orders in terms of classifications of different materials are, in my view, very antiquated. I've been to countless classified briefings in the SCIF, and I've read about them the next day or the previous day in the New York Times or wherever. Aren't we overclassifying information? Shouldn't we be disclosing more of it? What I find, and I say it in these briefings, our adversaries know what you're telling us about them. We know, our adversaries know all about it. They know we know. The only people who don't know are the American people. Aren't we overclassifying?
Yes, I've been very public in saying that overclassification is an issue, and it's one that we're working quite hard on. It is not going to be solved in the, quickly, because it is actually there are a lot of institutional issues that are at stake and challenging. And one of the things that we're doing, for example, is related to the fact that we recognize we produce an enormous amount of information. Some of it gets declassified over time. It is necessary for us to get that information out. We are trying to use technology in a more productive way to actually ensure that we are doing this at a more rapid rate. And we've had some progress on this, and there's actually money in our current budget proposals to try to increase the amount of technology and work that we can do in this area to ensure that we're pushing out information that should be pushed out. We are working with our FOIA officers to basically ensure that they are better staffed, that they're in position to be able to do more work more quickly, prioritize what is of the highest public interest. We are working through trying to ensure that we actually incentivize to the greatest extent possible accurately classifying things, not overclassifying things, et cetera. So I'm happy to share we've got a lot of lines of effort, frankly, on this issue to try to improve the situation.
Well, just one last quick question
Yeah.
on Evan Gershkovich. Are we making progress or not?
I honestly, this is not an area where I am involved in the specific talks, and I would rather, leave that
Okay.
to others.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Senator Bud, please.
Thank you, Chairman. General Director, thank you both for being here today. Director Haynes, the annual threat assessment, it states. Thank you, Chairman. General Director, thank you both for being here today. Director Haynes, the annual threat assessment, it states that the intelligence community assesses that, and a quote from there is, that Iranian leaders did not orchestrate nor had foreknowledge of the Hamas attack against Israel. So how confident are you about that assessment, and to the extent that you can discuss it here, how has October 7th impacted the relationships and operations of the broader Iranian threat network?
Sure, I can give a start at this, and General Cruz may have more to add too. I mean, I think we're reasonably confident and growing more confident over time that that assessment is correct with respect to their foreknowledge of the attack. And then in terms of the relationship impact that it's had, as you indicate, I think it has certainly increased the degree of work that is being done between, for example, Iran and the Houthis. That was obviously a longstanding relationship, but that one continues to build, and the Houthis are increasingly relying on Iran for assistance in their capacity and for weapon systems and so on, and to make them more precise in many respects. It is certainly continued. I mean, I think the relationship with the Iranian-aligned militia groups, as we often refer to them, within the region. These are classically Shia militia groups that have been working with Iran, that get money, training, weapon systems, and so on from them. And we continue to see that relationship. I don't know that it's had an enormous impact on the relationship since October 7th, but it has been one that's been quite active, obviously, during this period. And they've been assisting in the sort of strategy that Iran has taken with respect to the conflict in the region during this period. I would say that the relationship remains strong between Iran and Hezbollah, that, continues to be a key partner from their perspective, and one that they rely on to manage security in the region in many respects from their perspective. And I guess that's sort of a general waterfront landscape.
If we could, I'm going to ask
Of course, sir.
another part to that question, Director. Since October 7th, Iran has encouraged and enabled its proxies to conduct strikes against Israel and then also U.S. interests. In fact, we saw more than 100 attacks against U.S. forces in the Middle East, including the killing of 3 American soldiers. Those attacks have dissipated, but they seem to have started again. Director, what is the IC's assessment of whether the Iran threat network will renew attacks against U.S. forces, or has some level of deterrence been established? And Director, we'll start with you in general, if you would add in.
Okay. Yeah, currently they continue to sort of be in this pause. The question of how long it will last is, unknown to us, but here are some of the factors that I think are relevant to it. One is the Iranians have really been focused on pressuring the Iranian threat network, as you call it, the Iranian-aligned militia groups, on Israel, as you pointed out. That is sort of their primary instruction in many respects. And what has really, in part, been driving the Iranian militia groups in this scenario, particularly the Iraqi groups, has been also to drive U.S. forces out of the region and coalition forces out of the region, but particularly U.S. forces. And so how the talks with the High Military Commission go, how the conversation goes in Iraq, and how much Soudani is able to manage that, I think President Soudani will make a difference to essentially the calculus of those groups, and whether or not they initiate continued attacks is sort of where we are on this, but we'll continue to watch that. And we do think, obviously, that the pause reflects a certain amount of deterrence that's been established during this period. But again, these factors can adjust that, and it's possible for it to start at any time as a consequence of that discussion. But please.
I would probably just echo the point I would have made, would have been the Iraqi connection and what the drivers are in the calculus of the Iranian threat network and the Iranian-aligned militia groups. And then the deterrence, I think, that we have seen temporarily, it is a fleeting piece and needs to be refreshed and renewed or rediscussed. And it's the variables that the director laid out that I think will drive that.
Thank you. Bottom line, in the interest of time, could you describe the threats from Hamas and Hezbollah to the homeland and how they've evolved since October 7th, Director?
Yeah, I mean, in many respects, the greatest threat that they pose to the homeland is the degree to which they inspire folks within the homeland to conduct attacks. And also for other groups, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, Al-Qaeda and ISIS have basically directed, in a sense, renewed instructions to continue to go against U.S. interests. And so that is more of the impact that they're having with respect to the homeland at this point. But over time, that will develop, and I don't want to suggest in any way that the counterterrorism concerns that we have are significant at this point.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Budd. Senator Peters, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Haynes, as you know all too well, rapid technological improvements like artificial intelligence and advanced photo editing is allowing malicious actors to spread very sophisticated deep fakes of photos, videos, auto recordings. And I think one of a notable example of that was a video that was circulated in early 22 depicting Ukrainian President Zelensky appearing to surrender Russian troops in that deep fake. So in response to similar incidents, several Fortune 500 companies have created the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity to address these threats and to verify the origins of digital content. And in support of their efforts, I was pleased to include a pilot program in the fiscal year 24 NDAA for the DoD to assess the feasibility of establishing content standard technologies on DoD produced and owned media content, which can be used by malicious forces. So my question for you, Director Haynes, is with thousands of government websites containing digital content easily altered by our adversaries, how concerned are you about the proliferation of deepfakes and the resulting impacts on our national security?
Thank you, sir. I'm very concerned about the proliferation of deepfakes and the capacity to use generative AI and other technologies basically to improve information operations. And I think that's true just across the board. As you indicated, there was the example that we saw in the context of Ukraine. There was also a deepfake audio recording that we saw in the Slovakian parliamentary elections that had impact. There are a variety of examples now of these types of things being produced, and whether they're produced from information that is available through a government website or otherwise, frankly, they're a challenge.
Right. Director Haynes, I chair the Homeland Security Committee, and I'm keenly aware of the current and emerging threats associated with unmanned aircraft systems, both for the homeland as well as our folks abroad. And major technological investments are going to be clearly needed to combat these risks. But just as importantly, we need to actually synchronize all of our fragmented interagency efforts. So my question for you is, how's the intelligence community coordinating and sharing intelligence with your interagency partners to mitigate these UAS threats? And in that response, if you could tell us any roadblocks that you're facing in those coordination efforts to get everybody on the same page.
Thank you, sir. No, so obviously, you know that the Department of Defense has a counter UAS strategy. We have nested essentially against that our own. We do these sort of unified intelligence collection strategies, and it is intended to support that strategy. And that is sort of how we organize ourselves to ensure that we are, in fact, supporting the work that's getting done at DoD, but also in other parts of the U.S. government on these issues. And we really haven't encountered so much challenges in the context of interagency cooperation or sharing in this space, but more in the sense of just actually going after the problem, ensuring that we're actually getting the information that we need for supporting them, and also including talking to private sector and others who may have knowledge about some of the technologies that are being used, mapping out supply chains so that we can disrupt issues, things along those lines.
Good, very good. General Cruz, Russian disinformation efforts, including attempts to influence EU elections and spread harmful propaganda, are being used to achieve military objectives in the war in Ukraine. My question for you, sir, is what specific lessons has DIA gained from Russia's ongoing information operations?
So there's probably a couple, and I think I would even add to your question to say, what have some of our other adversaries learned from Russian misinformation campaigns? I worry probably less about our ability to how do we detect some of these pieces, which in partnership with the rest of the community, I think we're able to identify a lot of that data. The issue is how do you counter it? What is the pathway by which you can authoritatively say something is fake and then provide it to the people in an authoritative way? The piece that I do worry about is what are the Chinese learning? What are the Iranians learning? What does the impact of disinformation mean on all future battle spaces or in the lead up to future conflicts, which drives the need to really get our arms around how do we effectively and efficiently detect deep fakes and other pieces and have a dissemination system in the same way that we do with traditional intelligence.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Peters. Director General, thank you for your excellent testimony. We will now adjourn the open session and we will reconvene. Let's shoot for 12 noon in SVC 217. With that, I will adjourn the open session. Thank you.